A Man Without Face. Chapter 1. The Accidental President. Imagine you have a country and no one to run it. This was the predicament that Boris Yeltsin and his inner circle thought they faced in 1999. Yeltsin had been very ill for a long time. He had suffered several heart attacks and had undergone open heart surgery soon after he was elected for a second term in 1996. Most people believed he drank heavily, a common and easily recognizable Russian affliction, though some of those close to him insisted that Yeltsin's occasional bouts of disorientation and withdrawal stemmed from his persistent physical ailments and not from drinking. Whatever the reason, Yeltsin had become incoherent or gone missing during several state visits, devastating his supporters and disappointing his voters. By 1999, Yeltsin, his popularity rating dipping into the single digits, was not half the politician he had been. He still used many of the tools that had once made him great, making unexpected political appointments, alternating periods of hands-on and laissez-faire governance, strategically applying his larger-than-life persona. But by now, he most resembled a boxer gone blind, flailing in the ring, striking imaginary targets and missing real ones. In the second half of his second term, Yeltsin reshuffled his administration repeatedly and frantically. He fired a prime minister who had been in office for 6 years, replacing him with a 36-year-old unknown, only to bring the old prime minister back 6 months later to replace him again in 3 weeks. Yeltsin appointed one successor after another, only to grow disenchanted with each of them in a very public manner that had a way of embarrassing both of the object of Yeltsin's displeasure and anyone who witnessed the display of disaffection. The more erratic the president became, the more enemies he made, and the more these enemies banded together. A year before his second and final term was to expire, Yeltsin found himself at the top of a very fragile pyramid. His many reshuffling had forced out several political generations worth of professionals. Many ministries and federal agencies had worked, now young mediocrities, who had been sucked into the vacuum at the top. Yeltsin's trusted allies were now so few and so cloistered that the press called them their family. They included Yeltsin's daughter Tatiana, his chief of staff, Alexander Bolosin, his former chief of staff, Valentin Yumasev, whom Tatiana would later marry, another former chief of staff, the economist and architect of Russian privatization, Anatoly Chubais, and the entrepreneur Boris Berezovsky. Of the half-dozen so-called oligarchs, the business who had grown super rich under Yeltsin and had repaid him by orchestrating his re-election campaign, Berezovsky was the only one to remain firmly by the president's side. Yeltsin had no legal right to seek a third term, nor was he well enough to try, and he had every reason to fear an unfriendly successor. Yeltsin was not just an unpopular president, he was the first politician whom Russians have ever trusted, and the disappointment his people felt now was every bit as bitter as the support he had once enjoyed had been inspiring. The country was battered, traumatized, and disappointed. It had experienced hope and unity in the late 1980s, culminating in August 1991, when the people beat back the junta had threatened Gorbachev's rule. It had placed its faith in Boris Yeltsin, the only Russian leader in history to have been freely elected. In return, the people of Russia got hyperinflation that swallowed up their life savings in a matter of months. bureaucrats and entrepreneurs who stole from the state and from one another in plain sight, and economic and social inequality on a scale they had never known. Worst of all, many and possibly most Russians lost any sense of certainty in their future, and with it, the sense of unity that had carried them through the 1980s and early 1990s. The Eltsin government had made the grave mistake of not addressing the country's pain and fear. Throughout the decade, Eltsin, who had been a true populist, riding the buses and mounting the tanks, whichever the situation happened to require, increasingly withdrew into an impenetrable and heavily guarded world of black luminous scene and closed conferences. His first prime minister, the brilliant young economist Igor Gaidar, who came to epitomize post-Soviet economic reform, made it plain the public that he considered the people too dumb to engage in any discussion about reform. The people of Russia, essentially abandoned by their leaders in their hour of pain, sought solace in nostalgia, not so much in communist ideology, which had used up its inspirational potential decades earlier, but in a longing to regain Russia's superpower status. By 1999, there was palpable aggression in the air, and this was a large part of the reason Eltsin and the family were rightly terrified. Hurt and aggression have a way of rendering people blind. So the people of Russia were largely oblivious to the actual accomplishment of the Eltsin decade. Notwithstanding the many wrong turns made along the way, Russia had succeeded in privatizing much enterprise, and the biggest privatized companies had been turned around and made competitive. Despite an increase in inequality, a great majority of Russians had experienced overall improvement in their lives. The number of households with televisions, washing machines, and refrigerators grew. The number of privately owned cars doubled. The number of people traveling abroad as tourists nearly tripled between 1993 and 2000. In August 1998, Russia had defaulted on its debts, and this had caused a short but significant spike in inflation. But since then, the economy had been growing. The media were flourishing in an uncannily short period of time. Russians had taught themselves to make sophisticated, beautiful televisions and had also created an inordinate number of print outlets and several budding electronic publications. Many, though certainly not all, of the country's infrastructure problems had been addressed. Intercity trains were once again running on time. The postal service was working. The number of households with telephone landlines was growing. One Russian company, a cellular service provider founded in 1992, had placed its stock on the New York Stock Exchange and done very well. Yet the government seemed entirely incapable of convincing the people that things were indeed better than they had been a couple of years earlier, and certainly better than a decade earlier. The sense of uncertainty Russians had felt ever since the Soviet Union crumbled under their feet was so great that any losses seemed to confirm their expectation of doom, while any gains were transformed into fears of further loss. Eltsin had only his populist ways to fall back on. He could not challenge or reshape expectations. He could not lead the country in finding new ideas and a new rhetoric. He could only try to give the people what they wanted, and what they wanted was decidedly not Eltsin. Tens of millions of Russians held him personally responsible for every misfortune they had encountered over the previous 10 years, for their lost hopes and their shattered dreams, even it seems for their vanished youth, and they hated him passionately. Whoever came to lead the country after Eltsin could win easy popularity by prosecuting him. What the ailing president feared most was that a political party called Otykeisto Besha Russia, Fatherland or Russia, the name of hybrid of two political titles, sounds as inelegant in Russian as it does in English, headed by a former prime minister and several mayors and governors would come to power and exact revenge on Elgin and the family, and that he would spend his final days in jail. That is where Vladimir Putin came in. As Berezovsky tells it, the family was casting about for a successor. Incongruities of scale haunt this story. A tiny group of people, besieged and isolated, were looking for someone to take over the world's largest landmass, with all its nuclear warheads and all its tragic history, and the only thing smaller than the pool of candidates seems to have been the list of qualifications required of them. Anyone with any real political capital and ambition, anyone with a personality commensurate with the office, had already abandoned Elgin. The candidates were all plain men in grey suits. Berezovsky claims that Putin was his birthdays, as he told it to me at his villa outside London. I kept my promise to forget its specific location as soon as I returned to the city. Berezovsky had met Putin in 1990 when he was looking to expand his business to Leningrad. Berezovsky was an academic turned car dealer. His business was selling the Lada, the name Russian slapped on a car solidly made on the basis of a long outdated Fiat. He was also importing used European cars and building service stations to fix what he sold. Putin, then a deputy of city council chairman Anatoly Sobchak, had helped Berezovsky arrange to open a service station in Leningrad and had declined a bribe, and that was enough to make Berezovsky remember him. He was the first bureaucrat who did not take bribes. Berezovsky assured me, seriously, it made a huge impression on me. Berezovsky made it a habit to run by Putin's office wherever he was in St. Petersburg. Given Berezovsky's frenetic nature, these were most likely truly run by visits during which the oligarch would storm in, chatter excitedly, and storm out, possibly without registering much of his host's reaction. When I spoke with Berezovsky, he was hard-pressed to recall anything Putin had said to him, but I perceived him as a sort of ally. He said he was impressed too, that Putin promoted to deputy mayor of St. Petersburg. When Sobchak became mayor, later refused to position with the new mayor, then Sobchak failed to be elected. When Putin moved to Moscow in 1996 to take an administrative job at the Kremlin, the two began to see each other more frequently at the exclusive club Berezovsky maintained in the center of the city. Berezovsky had used his connections to arrange for no-entry traffic signs to be placed on both ends of a city block, essentially marking a segment of a residential street as his own. Residents of the several apartment buildings across the street could no longer legally drive up to their homes, but by early 1999, Berezovsky was a man under siege, like the rest of the family, but more so. He was the only one of them who valued his place in Moscow society, locked in a desperate and apparently losing power struggle with former Prime Minister Evgeny Primakov, who led the anti-Elgin political alliance. Berezovsky had become something of a pariah. It was my wife's, Lena's birthday, he told me, and we decided not to invite a lot of people because we did not want anyone to have to strain their relationship with Primakov. So it was just friends. And then my security tells me Boris Abramovich Vladimirovich Putin will be arriving in 10 minutes. And I said, what happened? And he said he wants to wish Lena a happy birthday. And he showed up 10 minutes later with a bouquet of flowers. And I said, Borodya, what are you doing this for? You have enough problems as it is. Are you just making a show of it? And he says, I'm making a show of it, yes. And this was how he cemented our relationship, starting with the face that he would not accept a bribe. then refusing to abandon Sobchak, and then this incident which made me sure that he was a good direct man, a KGB man. Yes, but still a man. It went straight to Berezovsky's head. Berezovsky was made in the same mold as other early Russian entrepreneurs. Like all of them, he was very intelligent, well educated, and a risk lover. Like most of them, he was Jewish, which had marked him as an outsider from the time he was a small child. Like all of them, he had outsized ambition and boundless energy. He was a mathematics PhD who had started in business with a car import, export and service company. By leveraging credit against hyperinflation, he had essentially swindled Russia's largest car maker out of millions of dollars in the early and middle 1990s. He got into banking, continued to keep a hand in the car business, acquired part of a large oil company, and most important, placed himself at the helm of Russian public television or Channel 1, the country's most watched television channel, which gave him unfettered access to 98% of Russia's household. Like other oligarchs, Berezovsky invested in Yeltsin's 1996 re-election campaign. Unlike the rest of them, he paralyzed his access into a series of political appointments. He scattered around the country, brokering political deals, negotiating for peace in Chechnya, and revealing in the spotlight. He cultivated the image of a kingmaker, certainly exaggerating his influence and just as certainly believing half of what he said or implied as he said or implied it. A couple of consecutive generations of foreign correspondents in Russia believed that Berezovsky was the country's shadow ruler. No one is easier to manipulate than a man who exaggerates his own influence. As the family looked for Russia's future leader, a series of meetings between Berezovsky and Putin commenced. By this time, Putin was the head of Russia's secret police. Yeltsin had obliterated the top brass everywhere, repeatedly, and the FSB, the Federal Security Service, as the successor agency to the KGB, and was no exception. If Berezovsky is to be believed, he was the one who mentioned Putin to Valentine. You must save Yeltsin's chief of staff. I said, we have got Putin, who used to be in the secret service, didn't he? And Balya said, yes, he did. And I said, listen, I think it's an option. Think about it. He is a friend after all. And Balya said, but he's got pretty low rank. And I said, look, there is a revolution going on. Everything is all mixed up. So there. As a description of the decision-making process for appointing the head of the main security agency of a nuclear power, this conversation sounds so absurd. I am actually inclined to believe it. Putin's rank was indeed low. He had left active duty as a lieutenant colonel and had received an automatic upgrade to colonel while in reserve. He would claim to have been offered a general's task when he took over the FSB and to have turned the honor down. It does not take a general to order colonels around, was how his wife explained his decision. It takes someone who is capable of doing it. Whether he was capable or not, Putin clearly felt insecure in his job at the FSB. He quickly began appointing people he knew from the Leningrad KGB to top positions in the federal structure. Meanwhile, he did not even feel safe in his own office. Whenever he met with Berezovsky, the two would take their conversation to a disused elevator shaft behind Putin's office. This was the only place in the building Putin believed their discussions would not be recorded. In this desolate and dysfunctional setting, Berezovsky met with Putin almost every day to talk about his battle with former Prime Minister Primakov and eventually about becoming president of Russia. The potential candidate was skeptical at first, Berezovsky recalled, but he was willing to listen. One time, Putin carelessly shut the door that separated the shaft from the hallway in front of his office, and the pair got locked in the elevator shaft. Putin had to pound on the wall for someone to let them out. In the end, Berezovsky, who fully felt he represented Russia, courted Putin. In July 1999, Berezovsky flew to Biarritz in southwest France, where Putin was vacationing. I called him ahead of time. Berezovsky remembered I told him I wanted to come and discuss something serious with him. I got there. He was vacationing with his wife and two daughters, who were still very young at the time, in these very modest condominium time accommodation. It was like an apartment building slash apartment hotel. A small kitchen, a bedroom, or a few bedrooms. Really very modest. By this time, Russian millionaires, of whom Putin no doubt was one, had become accustomed to taking their vacations in giant villas on the Côte d'Azur. This was why Berezovsky was so impressed with Putin's unassuming holiday arrangement. We spent an entire day in conversation. In the end, he said, "All right, let's give it a shot. But you do understand that Boris Nikolaevich Eltsine has to be the one to say it to me." All of this resembled an old satiric joke. A matchmaker calls on an aging tailor to discuss the possibility of arranging his middle daughter's marriage to the heir to the Rothschild's empire. The tailor puts up several objections. He has no business marrying off his middle daughter before the older ones have found a match. He does not want his daughter to move far from home. He is not so sure the Rothschild are as pious as his daughter's husband ought to be. The matchmaker counters each argument with his own. That is, after all, the heir to the Rothschild fortune. Finally, the old tailor relents. "Excellent," says the matchmaker. "Now all I have to do is talk to the Rothschild." Berezovsky reassured Putin. "I said, Volodya, what are you talking about? I was sent here by him, just to make sure there was no misunderstanding, so it would not happen that he would say it to you, and you responded like you have to me on many occasions, by saying you don't want this. So he agreed. I returned to Moscow and told Yuma Sev about our conversation, and a short time later, I no longer remember exactly how many days later, Putin returned to Moscow and met with Boris Nikolaevich. And Boris Nikolaevich had a complicated reaction. At least I remember his saying one thing to me. He seems all right, but he is kind of small. Eltsine's daughter Tatyana Yumaseva remembers the story differently. She recalls Eltsine's then chief of staff, Bolosin, locked in an argument with her former chief of staff, Chubais. Both agreed Putin was a good choice for successor, but Chubais did not believe the Russian parliament would confirm Putin as prime minister. While both were presenting their cases to Eltsine, Berezovsky flew to Biarritz to pop the question because he wanted Putin and the rest of the country to believe he was a kingmaker, like the other participants in the presidential selection process. However, Tatyana Yumaseva remembers the panic with which they viewed the political situation and the country's future. Chubais believed that a Duma would not confirm Putin. There would be 3 votes and then a dissolution of parliaments. Communists united with former Premier Primakov and Moscow Mayor Yuri Ruzhkov would garner a firm majority in the next election, possibly even a constitutional majority. After that, the country would be on a slippery slope to catastrophe, and it could go for as far as civil war. The best possible scenarios was a new communist regime, slightly adapted to more modern conditions, but business would be nationalized again. Borders would be closed and many media outlets would be shut down. The situation was bordering on catastrophe, was how Berezovsky described it. We had lost time, and we had lost our positional advantage. Primakov and Ruzhkov were organizing countrywide. Around 50 governors out of 89 had already signed on to their political movement, and Primakov was a monster who wanted to reverse everything that had been accomplished in those years. Why, if the family saw the situation as desperate, did they see Putin as their savior? Chuvai said he was an ideal candidate. Berezovsky clearly thought he was a brilliant choice. Who did they think Putin was, and why did they think he was qualified to run the country? Possibly the most bizarre fact about Putin's ascent to power is that the people who lifted him to the throne knew little more about him than you do. Berezovsky told me he never considered Putin a friend and never found him interesting as a man, as a person, a strong statesman from a man so ebullient that he tends to draw anyone with intellectual ambition firmly and enthusiastically into his orbit and hold him there by sheer magnetism. The fact that Berezovsky never found Putin attractive enough to try to pull him close suggests he never perceived a spark of curiosity in the other man. But when he considered Putin as a successor to Yeltsin, he seemed to assume that the very qualities that had kept them at arm's length would make Putin an ideal candidate. Putin, being apparently devoid of personality and personal interest, would be both malleable and disciplined. Berezovsky could not have been more wrong. As for Chuvais, he had chosen none. Putin briefly when he served as an economic advisor to Mayor Sobchak in St. Petersburg, and Putin had just been appointed deputy. Remembered Putin as he had been during his first year of working for the mayor. It had been a uniquely charged year, and Putin had been uncharacteristically energetic and curious, always asking questions. Chuvais had left St. Petersburg in November 1991 to join the government in Moscow, and his initial impressions had remained untempered. And what did Boris Yeltsin himself know about his soon-to-be an appointed successor? He knew this was one of the few men who had remained loyal to him. He knew this was one of the few men. He knew he was of a different generation. Unlike Yeltsin, his enemy Primakov, and his army of governors, Putin had not come up through the ranks of the Communist Party and had not therefore had to publicly switch allegiances when the Soviet Union collapsed. He looked different. All those men, without exception, were heavy-set, and it seemed permanently wrinkled. Putin, slim, small, and by now in the habit of wearing well-cut European suits, looked much more like the new Russia Yeltsin had promised his pupil 10 years earlier. Yeltsin also knew, or thought he knew, that Putin would not allow the persecution of Yeltsin himself once he retired. And if Yeltsin still possessed even a fraction of this one outstanding feel for politics, he knew that Russians would like this man they would be inheriting and who would be inheriting them. Everyone could invest this grey, ordinary man with what they wanted to see in him. On August 9, 1999, Boris Yeltsin named Vladimir Putin Prime Minister of Russia. A week later, he was confirmed in that position by a wide majority of Duma. He proved just as like a brave, or at least unobjectionable, as Yeltsin had intuited.